in that space with the artwork when the space didn't even exist. That was really challenging because I wanted them to feel a connection to the cosmos.
She ultimately transferred her textile creations to digital images, which were then blown up into 3 separate huge mosaics in the ceiling of the station. Bailey says she sometimes visits the station on her birthday to talk to onlookers. Jean Shin, the artist behind the 63rd Street station, says she also visits her piece.
There's a series of 3 women who are reading. I just find that kind of relationship so beautiful. And I do often just make a little detour to be a visitor. And they're sitting there just waiting. And I think it's a kind of dialogue between women. The dialogue is happening between these women many generations later.
Women Artists in the Subway is happening Thursday at 6 p.m. Ben Yakis, WNYC News.
WNYC is supported by Charles P. Rogers, New York bed makers for 7 generations at 17th Street, Manhattan and Route 17, New Jersey. Handcrafted mattresses and beds since 1855. More at charlesprogers.com.
Marketplace Morning Report is coming up next, and then in 10 minutes at 9 o'clock, it's the BBC NewsHour on 93.9 FM. Let's check in with London to see what they're working on. London, good morning.
Good morning, WNYC. I'm Rebecca Kesby. On today's NewsHour, a US journalist arrested and accused of spying by Russia. We'll have the latest. Is North Korea using public executions to terrorize its own population? South Korea says it is. And a new revolutionary blood test for bowel cancer. That's BBC NewsHour coming up at 9 on 93.9 FM WNYC.
It's cold out there this morning. We're at 34 now, up a couple of degrees from where we started this morning. Sunny as well. Sunny and 46 for a high today, but the real feel down to 20. It'll be 42, but feeling colder than that for the first pitch for the Yankees home opener today at 1:05. So if you're going there, you may want to take a blanket if they allow it. And then up to 55 tomorrow and near 70 on Saturday with the possible thunderstorm in the forecast. Again, 34 and sunny at 8:51.
Home buyers get some breathing room.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by VantageScore. VantageScore's credit scoring models help expand financial inclusion by leveraging predictive analytics at VantageScore.com.
From Marketplace, I'm Sabri Benishore in for David Brancaccio. The number of mortgage applications in the U.S. increased almost 3% last week. That's according to the Mortgage Bankers Association. Refinancing activity rose too. Part of this is because home prices have been leveling off, but the real culprit is falling mortgage rates. Marketplace's Justin Ho has more.
Throughout the last few months, the number of people applying for mortgages has reflected whether mortgages were more or less expensive.
January picked up a bit as rates dropped. February, rates picked up. Activity fell off again. March is looking a lot better.
That's Mike Fratantoni, chief economist at the Mortgage Bankers Association. Mortgage application volume is still over 30% lower than it was this time last year. But Fratantoni says the recent increase shows that buyers are eager to pounce.
Even with rates coming back down from a peak of 7+% in October of last year to the low 6s, that has brought a lot of buyers back into the market.
Part of what's been preventing people from buying homes is that a lot of buyers don't qualify for mortgages, since rates have nearly doubled since the start of last year. Susan Wachter is a professor of real estate at the Wharton School.
Not that they didn't want to buy. In fact, they may be renting right now and paying more in rent. They would like to buy, but they simply don't qualify for a mortgage.
And every time rates tick down, Wachter says tens of thousands of people become eligible to apply. I'm Justin Ho for Marketplace.
Initial jobless claims, that's people filing for unemployment, increased 7,000 last week, a bit higher than economists were expecting. With that, let's do the numbers. The FTSE in London is up 0.7%. Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ futures also up in the 6 to 0.7% range, with the Dow future up 209 points. The 10-year Treasury yield is at 3.590%. Senate investigators are saying Credit Suisse, this is the Swiss bank that failed and was bought by UBS, Credit Suisse allegedly helped extremely wealthy Americans evade taxes and hid more than $700 million from the government. The Senate Finance Committee is calling for more fines. UBS shares are up 3% in pre-market trading. Major League Baseball is back. Today is opening day. And this year, the sport has a bunch of new rules that are all about speeding up the games. The hope is if they're shorter, they'll attract more fans to the ballpark, to TV, to streaming. Marketplace's Henry Epp has more.
Baseball games are slow, says Stefan Szymański, a professor of sport management at the University of Michigan.
The batters spend a lot of time hanging around when they come up to bat. The pitchers spend a lot of time winding up to pitch.
But now there will be a pitch clock. At most, pitchers will have 20 seconds to throw the ball.
By speeding it up, you can make it more exciting and so will attract more fans and in the end make more money.
Shorter games could sustain the sport in the long run, says Khalid Balouli at the University of South Carolina. He also pitched in the minor leagues. But he worries the pitch clock will take away some of the things that make televised baseball enjoyable, like in a ninth inning at bat in the playoffs.
Having only 15 seconds to capture the look on the manager's face, the look of the dugout, and not having any time to even scan the nervous fans.
At least those fans will get home at a reasonable hour. I'm Henry Epp for Marketplace.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by the Slowdown Podcast. Join award-winning poet Major Jackson, the newest host of the Slowdown, for a hand-picked poem and a moment of reflection every weekday.
As of mid-March, about 72 million people had already filed their taxes for this year. That leaves quite a few stragglers, though, who have still to go through the process of calculating how much we owe or are owed and filing it with the IRS. You know, a lot of other countries don't do it like this. The government just tells you how much you owe or are owed and sends a bill or cuts a check. This is called return-free filing. It has not taken off in the U.S. Tax prep companies, for one, are firmly against it. But according to Marketplace senior economics contributor Chris Farrell, there's a chance things could change. He spoke with my Marketplace colleague, David Brancaccio.
This basic idea called return-free filing has been proposed for the U.S., and it would work like this. The Internal Revenue Service, it takes the tax-related information it already gets. The wage data from your employer and, I don't know if you made any interest income, but the interest income from your bank. And taxpayers receive a pre-filled out form from the IRS. And if the return looks good, you sign it, send the IRS the money you owe, or you'll get your refund.
All right. So you save a ton of time and all this wading through arcane tax rules, and maybe it would help our blood pressure, I suppose.
I think it would. I mean, there was a study by economist Austin Goolsbee. He's now head of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And he says, look, you know, a lot of the burden of this tax code, it comes from the time costs associated with complying. And if you pay a professional, there is a cost. So the insight that's really driving this return-free filing proposal, look, the U.S. tax code is really complicated and confusing, but the typical taxpayer has a pretty straightforward return.
I remember this idea. It's not the first time I've heard of it. It's been lurking around.
Remember the Tax Reform Act of 1986, called on the IRS to study this. 1998, Congress called on the IRS to come up with a plan. Here's the thing. In the U.S., the tax preparation industry really doesn't like this idea, and they have lobbied hard against it. And so far, they've been really successful. But here's the thing. This is an idea that won't go away because it works.
But I got to ask about our friends at the Internal Revenue Service. They came out of pandemic with enormous backlogs and constantly talked about chronic underfunding. They got a raise, but apparently still backlogs. Would they be up to the task?
So this has been the really serious objection to the return-free filing. But the Inflation Reduction Act has $80 billion that's going to the IRS. And what that legislation says is they can spend it in 4 areas. And one of those 4 areas is to modernize their systems. So the IRS should be able to meet the challenge as it upgrades its systems. And tax simplification, which is, by the way, as you know, another windmill I've tilted against. If we got some tax simplification, that would also increase the number of taxpayers who might benefit from return-free filing. And David, we can always hope.
Marketplace's senior economics contributor Chris Farrell with us in New York this time. Good to see you.
It's great to see you.
Chris was speaking there with Marketplace's David Brancaccio. In New York, I'm Sabri Benishore, and you're listening to the Marketplace Morning Report. From APM, American Public Media.
WNYC is supported by Carnegie Hall, which presents Bernard Labadie conducting the orchestra of St. Luke's and guests Joel Harvey and Yeston Davis in an all-Handel program on April 13th. Tickets and information at carnegiehall.org.
Up next this morning, the BBC News Hour on 93.9 FM and the takeaway on AM 820. Today, the Brian Lehrer Show, a call to pause new AI development as leaders fear AI poses profound risks to society. Plus, the Camp Bus Line ending service to Manhattan. That's at 10 this morning. 34 and sunny now today, sunny and 46 for a high, but if you go out there, you'll feel that it feels colder than that. And then tomorrow, slim chance of showers, clouds, and 55. Warmer on Saturday, up near 70, with a chance for thunderstorms.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM, New York.
Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm Rebecca Kesby. Today, a US journalist arrested in Russia and charged with spying offences. His employer, the Wall Street Journal, denies all allegations. The Kremlin says the police had reason to detain him.
This is the prerogative of the FSB. They've already issued a statement from the Federal Security Service. We've nothing to add here. The only thing I can say is, as far as we know, he was caught red-handed.
Also, landmark laws passed in the Australian Parliament to reduce carbon emissions, but it wasn't easy to get the votes.
It's become clear just how much of a grip the fossil fuel industry has on Australian politics. At different times it has felt like we have been negotiating with the political wing of the fossil fuel industry in the form of the Australian government.
And how a simple blood test could stop thousands of cancer patients receiving unnecessary chemotherapy. First, the news.
This is Danielle Yałowiecka with the BBC News. Hello. Brazil's far-right former president Jair Bolsonaro has returned to his home country after 3 months of self-imposed exile in the United States. He has denied that he plans to lead the opposition to the leftist government of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who defeated him in October's general election. Our correspondent Camila Motta in Sao Paulo says Mr. Bolsonaro faces numerous legal challenges on his return.
He comes back to Brazil to a very challenging landscape in which he's investigated on multiple occasions, and for the first time in many years he doesn't have political immunity, which means he'll be tried in the common justice. So that scenario could dictate a lot on how he's going to behave from now on. There are 16 lawsuits against him in Brazil's Superior Electoral Court, some accusing him of abuse of power during the 2022 elections and spreading disinformation and casting doubts about the electoral system.
The US newspaper Wall Street Journal has said it's deeply concerned for the safety of one of its reporters who's been arrested in central Russia. The country's domestic security service, the FSB, earlier confirmed that the journalist Evan Gershkovich was detained in the city of Yekaterinburg and accused of spying. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg reports.
The FSB accused the Wall Street Journal reporter of unlawful activity and said he was suspected of espionage in the interests of the US government. They claimed that Mr. Gershkovich was collecting classified information about a Russian defense plant. In Russia, the charge of espionage carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. The Wall Street Journal said it vehemently denied the FSB allegations and that it was seeking Mr. Gershkovich's release. It called him a trusted and dedicated reporter. President Putin's spokesman claimed the journalist had been caught red-handed. Evan Gershkovich is the first reporter for an American news outlet since the Cold War to be charged with espionage.
The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has warned that China's ruling Communist Party intends to change the international order systemically to put China at its centre. In a wide-ranging speech, she said Beijing was moving from an era of what she called reform and opening to one of security and control. Danny Aberhard reports.
This speech set out the EU's stall regarding what Ms von der Leyen called the intricate relationship that binds the two powers, one she acknowledged had become more difficult recently. China, she said, was a partner on issues such as climate change and the bulk of trade, but also an increasingly assertive strategic rival. Her message was not to disengage, but to be clear-eyed about challenges and mitigate them with diplomacy and laws. They range from Beijing's burgeoning relationship with Moscow, despite Russia's war in Ukraine, to the need to protect sensitive dual-use technology.
You're listening to the World News from the BBC.
On WNYC, a hitman in an infamous Jersey City murder is now facing 16 years in prison. 74-year-old George Bratsenis was sentenced yesterday for the 2014 murder of political operative Michael Galdieri. A second hitman in the case was sentenced last month. Political operative Sean Cattle said he hired the hitman. He's awaiting sentences. Cattle's also cooperating with federal investigators. Urban honeybees can reveal clues about a neighborhood's environmental health. That's according to a new study that started in Queens and Brooklyn. Researchers found that honeybees randomly collect germs, both good and bad ones, as they forage for food. Elizabeth Hunoff is a computational biologist at NYU who co-led this study.
Each human being, each pond, each tree has its own microbial cloud that's surrounding it and that occupies the three-dimensional space.
The study ultimately expanded to Italy, Japan, and Australia. The researchers developed a way to measure the genetic signs of the microbes brought back to rooftop beehives. In Venice, the hives carried fungi related to wood rot. They think of all those old wood pilings. Brooklyn bees picked up bacteria that feed on chemical pollution. You can check out the study in the journal Environmental Microbiome. And now for Yankee fans, some lucky baseball fans will be in for a trip back in time if they ride the train to the Bronx Bombers open season. They're a home opener today at Yankee Stadium. The MTA says a vintage 1917 subway train will head to Yankee Stadium from Grand Central at 11 this morning. It's known as the Nostalgia Train. The MTA often runs them to special events like baseball's opening day. Your forecast now, 34 and sunny. If you're going out there today, it's going to be sunny, and 46. It's going to be chilly. It's WNYC.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour live from the BBC World Service in London. I'm Rebecca Kesby, and we begin in Russia because there are a number of stories developing there today. In a moment, we'll hear from Russia's Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta, who has told the BBC that Russian state propaganda is preparing people to think that nuclear war isn't a bad thing. But first, to a developing story in the past few hours. The arrest of a US journalist on spying charges. Ivan Gershkovich, who's currently working for the Wall Street Journal, was detained in the city of Yekaterinburg in the Urals. That's the Central Asian part of Russia. This is what the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has just had to say about his arrest.
This is the prerogative of the FSB. They've already issued a statement. A statement from the Federal Security Service. We've nothing to add here. The only thing I can say is, as far as we know, he was caught red-handed.
Well, our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg is live on the line from Moscow now with some more details. And first, Steve, what do we know of Ivan Gershkovich and the circumstances of his arrest? What's the official story there in Moscow?
Well, first of all, I know Evan Gershkovich. He's an experienced Russia reporter. He worked in Moscow for several years, worked for the Wall Street Journal. We believe that he was detained in Yekaterinburg, so 1,000 miles from Moscow. The Russian Domestic Security Service, the FSB, issued a statement accusing him of conducting unlawful activities, claimed that he was gathering classified information about a defense plant, and accused him of espionage in the interests of the US government. Now, a criminal case has been opened against him under Article 276 of the Russian Criminal Code, and according to that, the maximum possible punishment for espionage in Russia is up to 20 years in prison. We know that Evan was brought to Moscow. I was just outside the courthouse where he was brought. His lawyer, that's been appointed for him, wasn't allowed into the courtroom, but there he was officially arrested. He'll be remanded in custody for the next 2 months.
Now, has the Wall Street Journal had a response to this and any other American official comment?
Well, I have heard response from the Wall Street Journal, yes. I mean, the newspaper says it vehemently denies the FSB allegations. It says it's seeking Mr. Gershkovich's release, and it described him as a trusted and dedicated reporter. He, as I say, he's well known to Western journalists who are still in Moscow, so quite a shock, I think.
Briefly, Steve, I mean, is this fairly unusual? It seems that there hasn't been an American journalist arrested, well, since the Cold War, probably.
It is unusual. Now, I can't remember, actually, a Western journalist being arrested and accused of espionage in Russia since Soviet times. Obviously, over the last year, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a lot of pressure being put on Russian journalists writing in Russian, broadcasting in Russian for a Russian audience. Less pressure on foreign journalists. So yes, I'd say this is unusual.
And from one journalist's arrest in Russia to another journalist's warning about Russia, this is Dmitry Muratov, who's the former winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and I understand you've been speaking to him.
Yeah, it was quite interesting, actually. I mean, you know, he is the former winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. That, you know, doesn't guarantee him protection. It hasn't protected his newspaper, which has been closed down by the authorities. It didn't protect him from being physically attacked last year on a train as someone threw red paint at him, laced with acetone. And what he said in the interview is not going to change minds in the Kremlin. But, you know, in a society like Russia's, where clearly repression is growing, political persecution against opponents is growing, to speak to someone who is not afraid of going on the record and speaking out, I found that quite interesting.
Задает вопрос, почему не выходит? Я говорю, кто, куда выйдет? Причем эти люди...
The Russian authorities may have shut down his newspaper, but Dmitry Muratov refuses to be silenced. When we meet in Moscow, Russia's Nobel Peace Prize laureate is worried about how far the Kremlin will go in its confrontation with the West.
Два, считайте, поколения жили без ядерной угрозы.
2 generations have lived without the threat of nuclear war. But this period is over. Will Putin press the nuclear button, or won't he? Who knows? No one knows this. There isn't a single person who can say for sure.
С полной уверенностью скажет нет, не нажмет.
Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, Moscow's nuclear saber-rattling has been loud and frequent. There have been strategic nuclear drills and unsubtle hints to the West not to push Russia too far. A few days ago, Vladimir Putin announced plans to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. And then, one of his closest aides warned that Russia has a unique weapon, capable of destroying any enemy, including America. Is it all a bluff? Well, Dmitry Muratov has picked up some worrying signals.
Мы же видим, как российская пропаганда готовит народ к тому, что ядерная война – это неплохо.
In Russia, we see how state propaganda is preparing people to think that nuclear war isn't a bad thing. On TV channels here, nuclear war and nuclear weapons are promoted as if they're advertising pet food. They announce, we've got this missile, that missile, another kind of missile. They talk about targeting Britain and France, about sparking a nuclear tsunami that washes away America. Why do they say this? So that people here are ready.
Люди в России были облучены пропагандой.
People in Russia have been irradiated by propaganda. Propaganda is a type of radiation. Everyone is susceptible to it, not just Russians. In Russia, propaganda is 12 TV channels, tens of thousands of newspapers, social media, like the Russian version of Facebook, that completely serve the state ideology.
Если завтра не станет пропагандой. But what if, I asked Dmitry Muratov, what if tomorrow the propaganda suddenly stops? If it all goes quiet, what would Russians think and say then?
Вижу, что молодое, великолепное, образованное, прекрасное поколение.
Our younger generation is wonderful. They're well educated. Nearly 1 million Russians have left the country. Many of those who've stayed are categorically against what is happening.